Hello, historians, and welcome to On This Day in History. On this day in history, your daily insight into what has happened in the past and how it has influenced the events of the present. Because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So, a short look at the 9th of June. On this day in 1549, the Book of Common Prayer is first adopted by the Church of England. So this was the first modern version of the prayer book that is still used to this day by the Church of England. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna came to an end. This would last. This set a political situation that would last nearly a century and created, from the modern perspective, what you would call the European states. Now, the maps would change over and over again through the 1800s and, in fact, even in through the 20th century. But Europe from 1815 starts to become much more politically recognizable to the one we see today. So countries, new countries that were included on this from this particular Congress were countries like Belgium, which had not previously existed. And of course, it set the course, if you will, for the balance of power that would inevitably, well, perhaps not inevitably, but would eventually lead to World War I. In 1898, on this day, China decided to acquiesce to some demands from Great Britain and leased out the island of Hong Kong to the United Kingdom, to the British Empire, for 99 years. This is why it was handed back over to China in 1997, and in fact is still the site of much political interest today, because they had been run under a much more democratic system up until 1997. And there is still much tension between the inhabitants of Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland, because they have such a different culture in terms of how they see the role of the government, how they see their own individual freedoms. This is what the recent protests and perhaps continued protests in Hong Kong have all been about. In 1928, we also saw the completion of this particular flight between Charles Kingford Smith and Charles Ulm. They were the first to fly across the Pacific. They end their flight from California to Brisbane. Now, this is a little bit of a local gripe of mine as an Australian. Much of the time, you hear a lot about the Spirit of St. Louis and the first flight, transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. Oh, what a great achievement, my goodness. And it was. However, this flight was far, far, far more challenging and covered a far, far, far greater distance, and yet it seems to be lost into history. So I included here to make sure that this is remembered as the massive accomplishment that it was. And on this day in 1978, bringing us sort of full circle from our first event, 1549, a copy of the Johannes Gutenberg Bible, printed with the first printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, is officially known as the first book produced, but using modern technology, and it sells for $2.4 million for one copy of this book. It would have sold for much, much, much more, but there are 21 versions in existence. If there were only 3 versions, for example, you would imagine that would sell for much, much higher. Now, the Gutenberg Bible is indeed related to today's deep dive, because we are going to look at the Book of Common Prayer. Now, this might be, at first glance, something that you don't necessarily consider to be worthy of a deep dive. Yeah, they made a Bible. Okay, great. Lots of people make Bibles. But this one is actually very, very interesting and very, very influential. So it was first produced in England in 1549 during the reign of Edward VI. Edward VI, of course, is the son of the previous monarch, Henry VIII. Now, perhaps you are aware, I'm sure you are if you're all keen historians, that Henry VIII had his famous break with Rome, the creation of the Church of England. and the move away from Catholicism so he could divorce his first wife and marry his second, which was, of course, Anne Boleyn. So when Henry did that, technically he turned England into a Protestant nation, but really all he did was say, okay, everything's pretty much the same, but instead of the Pope, we've got me. This move towards the Book of Common Prayer was quite radical. So this Book of Common Prayer was actually written, or mainly written, by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and was the very first time that church services were written and performed in English in the country of England. The first time you're allowed to pray in your own language officially, I should say. Because, of course, before that, all services had been held in Latin, the official language of the Roman Catholic Church. Even though Jesus would never have spoken Latin, he actually spoke Aramaic. But anyway, and it was actually changed a number of times. The last time it was changed on a very, very large scale was 1662, but it has remained the official prayer book and virtually unchanged since that time. But keep in mind, this is supposed to be the official prayer book of the church. This is supposed to represent the word of God, but it has been edited, re-edited, and resubmitted numerous times. So it does not resemble the original. Now then, in terms of these particular gentlemen, this is on the top picture, Thomas Cranmer, I should say, I shouldn't be so casual. He was 60 in 1549, but he had been Archbishop, so the most important or most powerful member of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Since 1533, he had been appointed by Henry VIII. So he's been in this job for a long time. Now, this was a chance to make this new so-called Protestant church, because really it was basically just the Catholic Church, but no Pope. This was a chance to turn the Church of England far more Protestant. Protestants saw themselves as very separate and very different from Catholics, and there was a push by Protestants in England by this time to change the church, to update the church, to make it reflect Protestant ideals, instead of simply being a knockoff version of the Catholic Church, if you will. Now, the reason this took all the way to 1549 is everyone was so terrified of Henry VIII because of how he treated his wives and other numerous people who upset him, that no one dared to question the way he had organized his church. No one dared to say we need to make this far more different, far more Protestant, take power away from the king, for example. That wouldn't have gone down well with Henry VIII. But the new king was just 9 years old, Edward VI. Government and decisions were actually in the hands of a gentleman who was given the role of protector, because young Edward is far too young. He's not able to make these big decisions for himself. So the Duke of Somerset was appointed as protector. Now, this is the gentleman below the Duke of Somerset. He just happened to also be called Edward, but not Edward Tudor, like the king, but Edward Seymour. He is the brother of Jane Seymour, King Edward VI's mother. Or to put it a bit simpler, he is the king's uncle from his mother's side. So he is not related directly to Henry VIII at all, but he is related to Edward VI. Now, as protector, he was actually in charge of day-to-day policy, and he had a nickname around the corridors of power as the real King Edward. So all the big decisions actually went through this gentleman. While King Edward VI, the 9-year-old boy, was definitely, absolutely 100% the king in name, it was the Duke of Somerset who set policy and made decisions. For any of those Game of Thrones fans out there, think of him as the Tywin Lannister to Joffrey Baratheon in any event. Moving on to real history. Now, Protestants and Catholics have a few key differences, but the most striking is this one. Protestants believe in the idea of sola scriptura, which is the Bible only. If it's in the Bible, it is Christianity. If it is not in the Bible, it is not Christianity. Whereas Catholics believe, yes, if it's in the Bible, it's Christianity, but also new traditions that we've created or that we've been doing that aren't specifically stated in the Bible are also Christianity, as the Pope is also Christianity, and anything the Pope says, because he speaks for God, becomes Christianity as well. Whereas Protestants read the Bible and said, hang on, there's no mention of a Pope in here. If God had wanted a Pope, he would have put it in the Bible. It's not there, so therefore we're not going to follow. So this was the big difference. Generally speaking, Protestants become, in many ways, stricter Christians than Catholics in some ways. Now, the Book of Common Prayer was actually an attempt to compromise between these two factions, Catholics and Protestants. So they're not happy with one another. Catholics really did not like Protestants. They believed they were in defiance of the church because they weren't listening to the Pope, and the Pope speaks for God. So if you don't listen to the Pope, you're essentially not listening to God, so you are not a Christian. Whereas Protestants had the exact same view of Catholics, where they said, hang on, you're listening to the Pope, who is just a person on earth, instead of listening to God, which of course you listen to him through the Bible. So you guys are not real Christians. So they're both convinced that the other side is terrible and the other side is evil and the other side is not really Christian. So in order to sort of create a bit of ease between these two camps, the Book of Common Prayer was made to compromise. But as what happens a lot with compromise, it ends up that both sides don't like it. The fact that it was in English and not Latin, not the word of the church, made a lot of Catholics in England very, very upset, whilst Protestants thought it did not go far enough. It was still too Catholic. We wanted a way more Protestant document. And the thing that made Protestants most mad was a gentleman by the name of Stephen Gardiner, who is the man in the top image. He was a Bishop of Winchester before England broke away from the Catholic Church, so he was a Catholic. He was eventually arrested for his beliefs because he refused to change his beliefs and allegiance from the Pope to the King, to King Henry at the time. So he was arrested and thrown in the Tower of London. When he saw and read the Book of Common Prayer, he said that, you know what, this is Catholic enough, we can follow this. So this is fine for us. So speaking for Catholics of England, he said, this is fine. But that was a red rag to the Protestant cause. This made them furious. If a Catholic likes it, it must be terrible. So the Book of Common Prayer was not exactly a popular book at first. And this is what ends up happening to its author, Thomas Cranmer, ends up getting burned at the stake. Now, not only because he wrote this book, but as it made people so unhappy, he actually revised it himself in 1552 and made it far more Protestant, which was his way of saying, okay, I will please the Protestants as they are the ones in charge, and I don't want to make anyone upset. Kind of a problem though, because unfortunately young King Edward VI died and Roman Catholic Mary I became queen, and she tried him for treason. Because she was a Catholic, she made England Catholic again, and as an outspoken or seemingly outspoken Protestant, Cranmer was a threat. There was also the idea that Cranmer was the one who gave Henry VIII his divorce from his first wife, and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, just happened to be Mary I's mother. So she was quite mad at Cranmer for that reason as well. Now, whilst she put him on trial, whilst he was in prison, he was forced to say in public, I was wrong to support Protestantism. This was an idea saying, okay, we'll get people not to be Protestants, so he publicly says he's wrong. But they killed him anyway, and they burned him at the stake, 21st of March, 1556, because of his contributions to Protestantism, especially with the Book of Common Prayer. So the Book of Common Prayer was revised again in 1559, and it became much more Catholic. It became more influenced by Catholicism. This was because, of course, Mary I herself was Catholic. Now, funnily enough, even though Mary I would also die and be replaced by Elizabeth I, who was Protestant, she did not introduce a lot of changes to this more Catholic version of the Book of Common Prayer. So even though Protestants came back into power, the Book of Common Prayer itself was still heavily influenced by Catholic ideas and Catholic tradition. So the major change that we want to remember is on this day, this Book of Common Prayer, services were changed to English, which had previously been held to be a crime in England. As a matter of fact, many people themselves were burned at the stake for daring to own a copy of the Bible in English. How dare you have a copy of the Bible that you can read and understand? Because, of course, Latin was not spoken or understood by most people. And it was essentially a case of the priest would have to tell you what the Bible said, as opposed to you reading it for yourself. And that is actually part of the reason that Catholics and Protestants had such distrust for one another. Because, as I said, the official language of the church being Latin was actually the language of the Roman Empire, not the language of Jesus himself. And because the Bible was not able to be read by most people in Latin, it was when Protestants started reading it in their own languages, whether it be French, German, or English, and realized there's no mention of a pope, they felt they'd been lied to. And this created that sense of anger. Whereas on the Catholic side, they said, no, 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 it's supposed to be in Latin because it is only worthy of priests themselves to speak God. I hope that settles things for you, and I hope you've learned something. See you tomorrow.